welcome. We're happy to have you here for today's session. My name is Pauline, and I'll be your moderator today. This session is part of our Ask the Expert series on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and due to overwhelming demand and questions related to RTI, we've dedicated today's session specifically to that topic. So thank you guys all for joining. Before we jump in, I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping details. First and foremost, this webinar is being recorded. After the session, we'll send an email with a link to access the recording on demand. And if this is your first time using On24, we'll do a quick orientation to the platform. Pretty simple, front and center, you're going to see the slides for today's session. To the left of the slides is going to be the related content. This is where you can access the PDF and other valuable resources. If you don't see the related content section, there's a paperclip icon in your bottom navigation menu. You click on that, the related content section should open up. Now, to the right of the slides is going to be the chat feature. This is where we encourage you to submit all of your questions throughout the session. This is going to allow other attendees to upvote certain questions, so it'll help us prioritize the ones that are highest in demand. If you prefer to submit your question anonymously, we do have a mechanism for that. You can do so using the Q&A widget. It's not visible on your console, but in that bottom navigation menu, if you see the question mark icon or the Q&A icon, you click on that Q&A widget will open up, and that's how you can submit questions anonymously. That said, we typically receive a high volume of questions with several already pre-submitted. So while we are going to do our best to answer as many as possible during the live session, we likely won't get to all of them. And we've already aggregated some of the pre-submitted questions to make sure that we get to those first. After the webinar, we will work to address any remaining questions. So even if we don't get to it during the live session, we certainly will get you an answer. But I do want to note that responses can take up to 2 weeks just because of the volume of questions we receive. If your question is time sensitive, we would just encourage you to schedule a meeting with one of our experts, and you could do that right below the chat widget. You'll see a schedule a meeting widget, and that's where you can connect directly with one of our experts. Now, before we do jump in, just want to note one important disclaimer. The information shared today is not intended to be legal advice. We know regulations are constantly evolving, so we encourage you to consult with your legal counsel for guidance specific to your organization. So with that, let's dive in. I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Lynn Kaiser, Counsel and VP of Regulatory Affairs at Trizaic, a former Deputy Assistant General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and attorney at White & Case. She brings deep regulatory expertise to ensure Trizaic's compliance solutions are precise, defensible, and built to withstand scrutiny. So welcome, Lynn. And next, we have Anthony Poole, partner in human capital at Aon. Anthony has over 20 years of experience in rewards and workforce strategy. He's been leading Aon's pay transparency proposition across the region, helping clients prepare for the new EU directive and navigate these significant organizational changes. So welcome to you both. Now, quick orientation to the agenda. We'll do a couple poll questions, run into some EU Pay Transparency Directive updates, and then the majority of the session will be dedicated to your questions. So before we kick off, just have a couple poll questions for the audience. These are primarily just to get a sense of where everyone is at and how we're going to guide the conversation. So first, how prepared is your organization to handle right to information requests today? So for those who are fully prepared, making progress but not there yet, just getting started, or haven't started at all. So we'll give it a minute for everyone to get their responses in. These polls are going to be anonymous, like I said, just to give us a sense of where everyone is at, and when we tailor the discussion, how kind of in-depth we need to go or how high level. Looks like we still got a few responses rolling in, so I'll give it just a couple more seconds. All right. So it looks like we kind of have a majority of people in this middle bucket, so making progress but not there yet and just getting started. So hopefully this webinar will be very helpful for all of you as we dive into some of these questions. And then next question is, and again, just to help us ground the conversation, what's your biggest concern about RTI compliance? You can select select multiple options. So all that apply to you. This will help us kind of determine where to spend a little bit more time. But first, determining which pay elements to include, worker categories and scope of workers covered by RTI, data privacy and small group sizes, RTI communication and employee rights, country-specific rules, operational burden of requests, or if there is something else, which there certainly can be, that is also an option. And while those responses rolled in, I do see that some of you guys are having issues loading the PDF document. So I will make sure that we get a uncorrupted file in there that is easy for you guys to download. So if you just check back in maybe like 30 minutes while we're going through the presentation, I'll make sure to get a clean file uploaded for you guys to download. All right. And then here we kind of have, you know, all over the board. I think this looks good. I think a lot of these seem to be very popular, but quite a bit around data privacy and small group sizes, determining which pay elements to include, worker categories, country-specific rules, operational burden of requests, and then RTI communication and employee rights. So we will, all of these topics we're planning to cover. So hopefully we'll get your answers to those, but this is great information for us as we go through the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Lynn to go through some updates.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'm going to go over a few EU PTD updates since our last webinar last month. I know the focus of today's session is right to information, so I'll aim to be informative but efficient on this session. Moving on to the next slide. So if you are attending this webinar, I'm sure you're already, and it sounds like most of you are already on your EUPTD, have progressed on your EUPTD compliance. So I'm sure you're already familiar with the aim of the directive, which is to implement mechanisms for greater pay transparency as the EU works towards equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. And as a reminder, the deadline for transposition is June 7th, 2026. Although it remains to be seen how many member states will actually meet that deadline. Since the focus of today's session is RTI, I'm not going to get into each of these other components today, so I'll just note that RTI is one of the key pay transparency requirements under Article 7 of the EU PTD, which, if transposed on time, would take effect on June 7th, 2026. But again, that really depends on when it is actually transposed into national law. I'll refer you to previous webinars and other information that we have provided on other requirements. So getting straight into updates since our last webinar, starting with Finland. The government proposal to implement the directive was originally expected to be published, well, originally in 2025, then week 11 of 2026, which would have been last week. This has now been pushed back according to the official timeline to week 16 of 2026, which would be mid-April, April 13th through 17th. It'll then be submitted to Parliament. It's unclear what impact this delay in that stage of their legislative process will have on their proposed implementation date, which is currently May 18th, 2026. But that will likely get delayed. Romania, there is a draft in consultation stage. France, on Friday, March 6th, the Ministry of Labor sent a first draft of the bill to labor unions and lawmakers, and an additional consultation meeting is scheduled for March 19. The draft sent to the labor unions, however, only covers the private sector, so we're still waiting the Title II, which will be the provisions covering the public sector. For Sweden, on March 11, 2026, Sweden announced it intends to postpone the implementation of the directive to January 1st, 2027. This is big because their original effective date was going to be July 1st, 2026, just shortly after the transposition deadline. But now they've delayed it, which aligns with Denmark and Netherlands, and other countries have announced delays, with first reports due May 2028. Speaking of Denmark, Denmark published its first draft transposition proposal on February 26, 2026 for public consultation. The deadline for that consultation is March 27, 2026. I have a few slides about Denmark specifically later on, but I will note they have an implementation deadline set for January 1st, 2027. Germany, the draft legislation is expected to move forward in their legislative process in this month. We are still only out of Germany have the Commission report from back in November. Two other notes is Business Europe on February 27, 2026. Business Europe, a large employers organization, sent a letter to the European Commission requesting two things. The first being an extension of the EU PTD implementation deadline by 2 years due to administrative complexity. If the Commission sticks to their response back in December, that is unlikely to be granted. And the second is they had a number of requests for simplifying the compliance requirements. Some of those would require an amendment to the EU PTD. Others are possible for member states to implement under the current draft, under the current EU PTD. But one of the concerns Business Europe has is the differences in implementation across member states, which are difficult for employers to navigate if different member states take different approaches to requirements. Also, the EU-wide guidelines on gender-neutral job evaluation and classification systems from the European Institute for Gender Equality and the European Commission are also expected at the end of this month. Two other notes I'll just make that came up after the slide was prepared is yesterday, the Czech Republic introduced its first draft of its transposition, which is a minimal transposition of the requirements and leverages their existing unified monthly employer report, which was expected based on reporting a few months ago. And Greece has also released a very helpful, long employer handbook through their Fair Pay initiative. So that is available through Greece. So we don't have a Greek transposition, but we do have some employer guidance ahead of time from Greece that you can direct yourselves to. In terms of kind of like our current state of play on these next two slides, Belgium, we've got a partial transposition, but that's limited to the French community public entities. And we're still awaiting the federal transposition. The partial is already effective as of January of 2025. Cyprus is moving through on track. They've got a few drafts now of their transposition, which is very minimal transposition, but effective date to be decided, to be determined, but could transpose on time. Czech Republic, as I just noted, we do now have an introduced draft transposition. Denmark, and Czech Republic, I believe they are indicating a January 1st, 2027 transposition as well, of effective date as well. Denmark is January 1st, 2027. Finland, as I noted, that May 18th, 2026 date may shift back given recent announcements of delays in their next stage. France, we do have a draft in consultation, so that's moving through, but based on statements from their ministry, it's unlikely they will have those fully effective and implemented before the end of the year. Ireland, we have a draft of their pre-employment provisions, but not their remaining requirements, including RTI. And so that is where we're still awaiting that. And based on announcements from Ireland recently, they're going to approach this through a phased approach. And it's unlikely that requirements will be imposed on employers immediately upon that effective date. Italy, we've got a draft legislative decree that's moving through their process. We'll see if that transposes on time. Lithuania, there's a draft, but there hasn't been a lot of movement on the Lithuania front for a while. Malta, there's a partial transposition of some requirements. So they're a little bit ahead of the curve, but their RTI requirements that have been transposed don't fully align with RTI under the EU PTD. So we'll see what happens from there. Netherlands, we've got a January 1st, 2027 targeted implementation date. They were the first country to start announcing delays, and they're continuing to hold to that January 1st date despite the EU Commission statement in December that they're going to hold to the June 2026 deadline. Poland does have drafts available. They've already partially transposed pay transparency elements, which were effective back in December, and they're still targeting implementation on time for Romanian requirements. Romania, as just noted, there's a draft in consultation. Slovakia, there are drafts moving through the process. They could transpose on time, but even under their current drafts, there are provisions that would delay the pay levels by worker category component of RTI to January 1st, 2027. And then finally, Sweden had been targeting that July 2026 implementation date, and there's been announcements last week that that is going to be delayed to January 1st, 2027. And then we've got all of the countries down below that we don't have movement on to date. A quick overview of that Denmark draft transposition that was published in February, end of February. It is in consultation, targeting January 1st, 2027 implementation date, with the consultation deadline of the end of this month, March 27th. A general election has been called in Denmark, so it is uncertain how this is going to potentially shift the timeline for the draft. So we'll note that. Unlike most other drafts to date, Denmark is not implementing an exception for employers with less than 50 employees from providing pay progression criteria. They do stand out on that front. Right to information, though, generally aligns with the EU P2D, with a 2-month deadline. Employees must be informed annually of their rights, and a limitation of disclosure in accordance with Article 12.3 of the EU P2D, where identifiable information may be revealed. In Denmark, the workers' reps are the trade union shop stewards. I'll also note, before getting into the specifics of their pay gap reporting, Denmark does also specify that there's a presumption, there's a preemption in favor of collective bargaining agreements, where if obligations, to the extent obligations have been agreed to separately in a collective bargaining agreement, that can control over these requirements. Following is the slide currently showing that second Denmark slide?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I saw it jump around, but you're good right now.
Great. For worker categories, the worker categories, as we know and we'll discuss later, must be based on work of equal value. This is very key in Denmark, because Denmark is taking the approach of having Statistics Denmark, which already collects payroll information and other data from employers. They will be sending a wage statement to all employers. And then after consulting with employee representatives, the employer will then submit that on to the equality body, which will be the Danish Labor Market Institute for Equal Pay. But supplementation may be required, and the employer is required, while the wage statement received by Statistics Denmark will contain all components of that pay gap reporting requirements. The employer is still responsible for ensuring that those, especially for the pay gap by worker category, that actually reflects worker categories that reflect work of equal value, which may not align with what the wage statement from Statistics Denmark includes, which is going to be based on DISCO codes, which is an employment classification coding system within Denmark. And the explanatory notes are very clear that it is expected that those DISCO codes will likely be insufficient in many cases to reflect the worker categories required under the EU P2D, which is going to require supplementation by the employer before it is submitted on to the Institute for Equal Pay. And then supplementation may also be required if, for example, an employer has workers who aren't paid on an hourly basis, since that is the information collected by Statistics Denmark. So Denmark is trying to leverage existing reporting mechanisms, but it is still going to require oversight by employers in order to ensure that they are compliant with the EU P2D. And then the deadline for that first reporting is going to be in 2028, with first wage statements sent out September 1st, and then the employers will have a month to review. Employers can also form their own wage statement without the assistance of Statistics Denmark, and that will have a separate deadline of December 31st of the reporting year. So this is all important because it's another country also indicating this delayed implementation. So it's unclear at this time if we're going to see any then movement from the EU Commission. Finally, we're getting into RTI just to set the stage as we move into our Q&A. Did want to go through the main requirements of RTI. What you see on the screen are the exact wording of paragraphs 1 through 4 of the Article 7, which is the right to information. So workers shall have the right to request and receive in writing their average pay levels, as well as the average pay levels broken down by sex for categories of workers performing the same work as them or work of equal value to theirs. Those pay levels being both the gross annual pay and the corresponding gross hourly pay of both, that's going to be both their own as well as the average for their worker category broken down by sex. 2, workers shall have the possibility to request and receive the information referred to in paragraph 1 through their workers' representative or through an equality body. And this is all going to be in accordance with national law and or practice. So that's going to differ by transposition, how exactly this mechanism should work. But employers should be aware that they need to ensure that employees have a method of making these requests through their workers' representatives. If the information received from the employer is inaccurate or incomplete, workers are going to have the right to request additional and reasonable clarifications and details regarding what they received and receive a substantiated reply. And so far there has been, some of the transposition drafts have been very clear that this is only it's not supposed to provide additional information beyond what you're required to provide under RTI. But it remains to be seen how exactly member states are going to approach the additional and reasonable clarifications and details piece and what must be provided there. Next, the employer shall inform all workers on an annual basis of their right. This is the annual notification, as well as the procedures for exercising that right. And employers shall provide the information in so your RTI information, within a reasonable time, but in any event within 2 months from the date on which the request is received. So you're going to need to be able to track those responses. And some countries are already indicating they may shorten that response time period. Specifically, Poland and Romania are looking at a 30-day response time period, not a 2-month. And the final one is just the Article 7, paragraph 6. I'll flag because that one does allow employers also to require workers who have obtained this information to not use that information for any purpose other than to exercise the right to equal pay. So keep in mind that that may be in the drafts as well, that you can restrict the use of the information, not their own pay levels, but the pay level by worker category. And now I think we're ready to get into the Q&A. So I'll turn it back over to you, Pauline.
All right, thank you, Lynn. So what we did is we did try to aggregate all the pre-submitted questions. We kind of found some high-level themes. So I think some of the questions we're seeing in the Q&A in the chat we'll cover as we go through some of these submitted ones. But I'll volley the first one to you, Anthony. So what exactly must employers provide in response to an RTI request? So some of the questions that came around this were which pay elements to include, whether it's base pay, bonuses, incentives, benefits, whether the data should reflect total remuneration or selected components, and then really what figures should be used. So whether it's averages, medians, ranges, actuals, targets. So quite a few questions in that one, but I'll let you kick that one off, Anthony.
Perfect. Thanks, Pauline, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I think, in answering this question, Lynn has set the scene really well with, going back to the source text, right? It's important to make sure we recognise what does the directive ask of us. And again, importantly, there will be iterations based on transposition across individual locations. But fundamentally, what do we need to provide? The workers have the right to receive information on their individual pay level and the average pay levels broken down by sex for categories of worker performing the same work as them or work of equal value to theirs, right? So that's the first point. I think the second one that's really important within there is this word pay. and we come back to this a lot within the directive. When we define pay under the EU Pay Transparency Directive, it is a broad and almost all-encompassing term. We should be considering salaries or any other consideration, whether in cash or in kind, which workers receive directly or indirectly from their employer. So some of the examples that are referenced again within the directive itself says complementary or variable components may include but are not limited to bonuses, overtime compensation, travel facilities, housing and food allowances, compensation for attending training, payments in the case of dismissal, statutory sick pay, statutory required compensation, and occupational pensions. So when we say pay, a common misconception under right to information is we're just talking about base salaries. We're not. We are talking about pay under the definition of the directive. We come to this question about what should be included. That was a long list that I just ran through. And ultimately, in our working with clients, they are working through this themselves on a location by location basis. What of these components do we provide? We need to be very careful to make sure we are not intentionally removing anything or withholding anything that is driving any differential between gender, right? So we want to include everything. We want to make sure, obviously, two very important points. One is that we're doing an apples to apples comparison. So when I show Anthony his right to information request, the components I include for Anthony need to be the same as the components I'm including for the category of worker, everyone else within that worker. The other common misconception, there is no requirement here to break out those individual components, right? We are providing the right to information request on that overall pay number, whatever we determine it to be. We don't have to break it down between salary, between bonuses or any other items. It is a single number, but we need to make sure that everything is in that number. And again, it should be holistic, not omitting any items to present a better picture. That would be inadvisable. The question came up about should it be average versus actuals versus target. It is the average number. Again, back to this Article 7 right to information statement. And it should be actuals as well. We're not talking about targets here. We're not talking about the ranges we typically stipulate for an individual category. These are actual numbers calculated off the number of people in that category in order to reflect that right to information. So a few different things in there, but hopefully that gives some clarity. And Lynn, you may have some further comments on that as well.
I think that's pretty comprehensive. The only thing I'll add is to also just really pay close attention to the transposition drafts, because some of the definitions of pay that have been included to date have included some carve-outs that actually go against that much broader definition within the EU PTD. For example, Poland would, under the current draft, exclude the same cash or in-kind benefits received by all employees within a category of employees, or made available to all employees within a category of employees without any conditions for using them. The purpose behind that would be that those are not driving like inequities between employees, but I would direct everyone to really pay close attention to whatever carve-outs are being included there.
All right, thanks guys. And I think that's kind of a nice segue. I've seen a couple questions come through in regard to our second question. So what data set should be used for RTI responses and how current must it be? So we have seen a lot of questions regarding what that reference period should be in terms of kind of what data to use for RTI. And then there are certainly other questions in this, but I think I've seen that one come through quite a bit. So I'll turn that one over to you, Lynn, and then Anthony, if you have anything to add, absolutely.
Sure, and I think Anthony already responded on the actuals piece of this, which is like what data to use, should it be actual or versus target, and where that should come from. And so since you're dealing with actuals, it's probably going to be a combination of payroll and HRIS data, which can get complicated for many companies. In terms of reference year, this is where the EPT is a little unclear. It does not set a specific reference year for RTI. And we aren't seeing a lot of guidance in the transposition drafts to date on what the reference period should be and how up to date it should be. However, what our customers are planning are monthly or quarterly refreshes with a 12-month look back to capture that annual component of the pay levels. And this is because countries like the Netherlands have specifically said that, yes, you can leverage previous year data that was used in reporting, but the data should, for RTI purposes, should be quote unquote up to date. So it doesn't say what exactly is up to date, what qualifies as up to date, but we are expecting that to be a more up to date than just looking at that previous calendar year. The EU PTD does specify previous calendar year for pay gap reporting purposes, but not specifically for RTI. So that's going to be something where we are also paying close attention to transposition drafts to see if we get more guidance there. And there have been some drafts that have referenced calendar year, but it's unclear at this time if they're going to be they're going to use that as a restriction on that reference time period. I just touched a little bit on how this differs from gender pay gap reporting because the time frame is different, but the definitions of pay and your worker categories should align. They are the same definition of the UPTD for both, and pay levels are that are used for RTI are also, that same definition is used in determining your gender pay gaps for gender pay gap reporting. So it's important to keep in mind that whatever you're working towards for RTI, those same worker categories and pay will then be leveraged for gender pay gap reporting as well. And in terms of mid-year hires, promotions, or part-time workers, there is no basis for excluding them. It'll be important to look at who is counted, if there's any additional guidance given by transpositions. But this is where that gross hourly component of your pay level is going to come in handy, because that is where you're going to be able to control for hours worked throughout the year to show the gross hourly component of their pay versus others who are hired at different times. Anthony, anything you'd add on that point? Or any of these points?
No, I mean, I think that's really comprehensive, Lynn. I think, you've reinforced a couple of fundamentals there, which is, we fully recognise the challenge here. It's trying to get to that single number for benefits for everyone. Currently I probably have that for a lot of the pay elements we traditionally recognise, the compensation items, but do I have it for the benefits piece as well? So that's the work involved in this. And, the other point I'd reinforce is a holistic and clear rationale between what we've included. As you say, there wouldn't be a clear rationale for excluding mid-year hires or promotions. So we just have to be mindful of that and not trying to in any way kind of affect the outcome in an unclear way.
All right, thanks, guys. And I think that gets most of the questions around this topic. So I'll go to question 3. So how should organizations define categories of workers for RTI comparison? So some of the questions around this topic were how to identify or define work of equal value, whether job architecture elements such as job, family, function, level, or grade are acceptable in defining a category of worker, and then whether employees can challenge the category used for their comparison, which we may touch on maybe a little later. But I'll turn this one over to you, Anthony, and then Lynn, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. I mean, obviously, category of work is a fundamental concept of the directive. In Article 3, it talks about category of workers are workers performing the same work or work of equal value, grouped by objective and gender-neutral criteria. In Article 4, the criteria to assess work of equal value needs to include skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, and, if appropriate, any other factors which are relevant to that specific job or position. So that does give us a few options for how we can potentially use to categorise workers. One obvious one is job level, using an objective, gender-neutral job evaluation methodology. I'm sure many of you have come across that conversation already. We can also then further look at grouping workers by job level as well as job family. And I think this is something for organisations to consider themselves in terms of their own organisation and structure if they want to go to that further level. We could also think about categorising workers based on classifications agreed with works councils or under collective labour agreements, etc. Or we can use some combination of the above. But again, in whichever way we decide to do that as an organisation, and there will be different outcomes for different businesses, we need to make sure that we have a fundamental basis around work of equal value for any classifications, and we need to be very clear in our rationale of how we've determined that. So say whether we're using level, whether we're thinking about job families as well, and thinking about any of those collective agreements, we just need to have a really clear rationale and link back to that Article 3, same work or work of equal value in terms of categorisation. Lynn, I don't know if you add on to that question.
The only thing I'd add is on that last point is whether employees can challenge the category used for their comparison, and just note that this is where worker representative kind of buy-in for your categorization may actually come in handy, because you will be required, depending on the national transposition, to work with your workers' reps on both the criteria used for these workers' categories and potentially even the groupings as well. And if you have it's important to have your workers' representatives understand how you are grouping these as well, and to make sure that they're defensible before them, so that when the employees also are questioning it, you can direct them also to the workers' reps and your collaboration with them as well.
Thank you, guys. So next question is, which types of workers fall within the directive scope for RTI requests? So I saw a couple questions come through in relation to this, but permanent employees, fixed term workers, agency workers, contractors, so on and so forth. And then clarity on how we should handle employee representation in smaller countries where we don't have unions or works councils. So those are some of the questions regarding scope for RTI requests. And I guess I'll turn this one over to you, Lynn, to answer first.
Yeah, so the scope of worker is very broad under the EU PTD, and it is also as defined by law, collective agreements, and/or practice in force in each member state. That's under Article 2. So it's going to depend a lot on each member state, but the baseline is that it's going to be very broad, who is included and who is excluded. Under Recital 18, it states that the directive should apply to all workers, including part-time workers, workers on a fixed-term contract, and persons with a contract of employment or employment relationship with a temporary agency, as well as workers in management positions who have an employment contract or employment relationship as defined by law, collective agreement, and/or practice in force in each member state. So this is very broad. It also even goes on and says, provided they fulfill the relevant criteria, this could also include domestic workers, on-demand workers, intermittent workers, voucher-based workers, platform workers, workers in sheltered employment, trainees, and apprentices. So we're talking a very broad scope. So unless specifically carved out in the nation-state national transposition, the default approach to, especially in the absence of a specific transposition, is to assume that we're looking at a very broad definition of employees and who will need to be included here. In terms of employee representation, since the worker representative is also similarly defined with reference to national law and/or practice, it is likely that whoever your typical employee representative currently, whether that's works council, trade union rep in each country, is likely to be the employee representative in the transposition. This isn't 100%. So it's important now, like even in the absence of transposition, to identify who those existing employer representatives are. And then if you are in a smaller country where you don't have unions or work councils, that's going to depend on the transposition, whether they're going to, and for the purposes of certain of the requirements in the PTD, they may require you to create a process for employees to elect their own employee representatives to fulfill the roles that are required under the EU PTD. For example, to be able to submit a request, RTI request through your employee representative. Anything else you'd add on any of these points, Anthony?
Oh, I think we might have lost him briefly, but I'm sure he'll join back in. All right, so I will jump to the next question, and I think this is where we get quite a lot of questions, so we might spend a little time here. But how should employers handle RTI requests when comparison groups are very small? So we got a lot of questions on, is there a minimum headcount threshold? How to avoid revealing individual salaries. So some of the questions brought up scenarios where you have maybe like 20 people in one gender and a single person in another. How to remain compliant with GDPR and local privacy expectations, and then how to handle groups with only one gender specifically. So I think as we wait for Anthony to rejoin, do you want to take this one, Lynn, and see if we can get him back?
Get started while we wait for Anthony to join. So just to start off, having a small comparison group, small worker category, or only a few of specific gender within your worker category, that's not going to remove the RTI obligations in that situation. It may, depending on the transposition, change how the RTI information is provided. So that's under Article 12, Section 3 of the EU PTD around data protection, where member states may decide that where disclosure of that information, both under this Article 7, RTI, and gender pay gap reporting and joint pay assessments, would lead to the disclosure either directly or indirectly of the pay of an identifiable worker. Only the workers' representatives, the labor inspectorate, or the equality body shall have access to that information. So it's a limitation on who can receive the information, not a limitation on the actual size of the underlying category of worker, because those category of workers should still be based on work of equal value, which may, especially if you have smaller headcounts in certain legal entities, may lead to smaller worker categories. But in those situations, you may be required by the member state to only provide that information to the employee representative, who will then, or equality body, labor inspectorate, who will then work directly with the employee to advise them on whether they may or may not have an equal pay claim or what that information reflects. This is not going to be, it's an optional component of the EU PTD for member states. And some member states like Sweden and the Netherlands are not imposing this limitation on disclosure. So it's important to keep in mind that this is not going to be put in place in every country. There may be situations where that information may be disclosed anyway, even where you do have smaller headcounts. In terms of how to set the threshold where the limitation has been in place, no country to date has set a specific threshold number at which point you would limit the disclosure to the individual employee. So right now it would be within, based on a good faith assessment by each employer as to how small of a worker category or number of each gender in a category would potentially lead to the identification of another employee's individual pay. So you'll have to do a good faith assessment of what that threshold should be. And I will note, though, we do hope to have additional guidance from countries on this. And Finland has stated that in statistical practices in Finland, the minimum threshold has been set at 5 employees, but that the number cannot be determined precisely, and the assessment is always case by case. On the GDPR front, just to note, because Sweden and Netherlands aren't imposing this disclosure limitation, even Poland, that is imposing the limitation, has stated that they don't actually view it as a requirement of the GDPR to do so, but they're doing it for privacy concerns and as an optional implementation piece of the EU PTD. Welcome back, Anthony. Sorry, I end up still this question for you.
No, thank you, Lynn. I appreciate you carrying the can. It's the worst nightmare on a webinar is that the technology cuts out. But thank you. I think on that one question, I heard the back end of what you said, and I think that covers most of it. It's probably the question we get more than anything else, but certainly on whether it's right to information or any of the pay equity analysis is what is the staple size. And as you say, there isn't any official guidance out there. The one piece we have seen is that the German expert commission did recommend groups of not less than 6 people So that would obviously, in this context, right to information would be 6 males and 6 females, because we're doing the analysis against males and females. We're doing separately by sex. So that's another number that's out there. It's not official requirement. It's not official guidance. It is proposed suggestion. But I think anything's helpful, and ultimately our clients are thinking carefully for themselves about what is an appropriate number that we would need to be able to report.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I was going to say that one is certainly a common question we receive. So next question, and I'll turn this one to you, Anthony, but if an RTI response reveals an unexplained pay gap, how should employers investigate, justify, and communicate the difference without creating isolated pay adjustments or triggering discrimination concerns? And then there are some sub-questions, but I'll lead with that, and we can fold some in as we go along.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, obviously, the response is to provide the average pay level broken down by sex, and then also to explain the basis for the differences. Talk about gender-neutral factors as part of our pay equity analysis, and then what comes down to the gap. If we can't justify that gap based on those gender neutral factors to within that kind of 5% number, there are obviously individual enforcement rights. The individual employee can challenge internally or externally, and they have at that point got the ability to rely on that kind of reversal burden of proof, if you like. It is on the employer to prove under the EU directive, not the employee. So potentially they can go down the path of seeking compensation. Broader escalation, the joint pay assessment idea isn't triggered automatically by an individual right to information request. The 5% gap in a full category, having no objective justification, and if it's not remedied within 6 months, are the 3 things that need to happen to trigger that joint pay assessment. So the right to information doesn't do that in its own right, but it probably is the first trigger or the first step for the organisation, and we'd be expecting that probably the employer would remedy that quite quickly, that it doesn't escalate into that broader right to information request. It is a case of if that doesn't happen, then it does potentially move us into an individual pay claim, or indeed the firm-wide joint pay assessment obligation. But I think worth understanding that the right to information request in itself doesn't trigger that broader joint pay assessment. Lynn, I don't know if you had more to that response.
No, I think you've got everything covered there.
All right. So next question is, how should organizations communicate employees' right to information? Some of the questions around this topic were, how often can employees request pay information? How employers should notify employees of this annually? And if there are any penalties if it's not communicated? What level of explanation should be provided in the RTI response, which I think, Anthony, you may have covered a little bit. And then, and also same with this one, how should organizations equip managers to explain raw pay gaps and communicate objective pay factors clearly to employees without relying on complex statistical explanations? So I'll turn this one over to you, Lynn, to kick off. And then Anthony, if you want to add color, you're certainly more than welcome to.
Sure. Working my way down those is how often employees may request the pay information. It's not limited in the EU PTD and has not been limited in draft state. That being said, the German Commission did recommend that it be limited to a request made once a year. And the Business Europe that I just mentioned in my overview slides, this was one of their simplification requests, is that RTI be limited to once a year. But right now, there's no transposition drafts out there that are imposing such a limitation. How employers must notify employees annually. There's no required methodology within the EU PTD. So it is, to a degree, left up to the employer, and the drafts to date have really given a freedom of methodology to the employers. But that being said, you're going to want to make sure whatever notification you provide is documented for auditing purposes, and also that it sets like clear procedures for your employees to make those requests, so that you're able to then comply with your requirement to respond to those requests within a certain period of time, and potentially even respond to any follow-up requests for clarifications within a certain period of time. So having clear procedure in place through that annual notification is also important for employers as well. And it also doesn't set, the EPTD does not set a certain timeline for providing that annual notification. So that is also left up to employers unless it's specifically imposed by a transposition. For example, Poland is setting that requirement to be by March 31st each time. In terms of methodology, I know employers are considering a number of different things. You're going to want to make sure it's in such a way that, as I said, you can document it, and that you have a good faith basis that you are providing notice appropriately to all your employees, no matter where they work. So if they're not regularly using an intranet, it may not make sense to only include it on the intranet available to your employees. You may also want to consider alternative notice provisions, which may also mean looking at local labor laws to what complies with appropriate notice for legal requirements to your employees. And then in terms of level of explanation in the RTI responses, the RTI requirements itself are very high level, just provide the pay levels, and the pay levels broken down by sex for your worker category. That's where like an optional RTI narrative can really come in handy for employers that explains what the wage influencing factors such as tenure, performance, skills development that can vary your pay even within your own worker category. You can also use that RTI narrative to explain your commitment to pay equity, any ongoing processes you have to address pay disparities, contextualize differences in pay, explain how to follow up on additional questions, because as Anthony flagged, this might start escalating towards an equal pay claim because they're just receiving this information without any context. So providing additional context can help head off those types of claims, and providing maybe an alternative escalation process if they do have additional questions outside of an RTI process. And then that's also where you can provide any disclaimers, like here's the time frame used, the methodology, pay components, and how worker categories are formed and how updated the information provided is. So that's going to be a very useful tool for employers to kind of contextualize what the information they're providing are. Anything else you'd add, Anthony, on those points?
I mean, I think that's really comprehensive, Lynn. You know, the point around the directive is very, very clear. The employer has kind of the positive duty to inform on this piece. And I think the only other thing we touch on, I think you touched on, is, you know, a one-off notice is unlikely to be enough, right? It needs to be an ongoing thing, probably annual. And as you say, in a way that everyone can recognise it, not buried anywhere, not kind of done in a way that isn't easily retrieved by any workers, to make sure they understand their rights.
And as I said, that also is to the advantage of the employer, because if it's very clear the procedure, it allows the employer to more easily track those requests and respond to those requests. I also noticed that there was what was a potential, if you don't comply, are there any penalties? And I'll just note on that, that's going to vary by member state. There will be penalties involved with non-compliance, and those may look like administrative penalties, sanctions, et cetera. It's varied by member states exactly what non-compliance may mean, but there will be a penalty associated.
Awesome, thank you. So next question, and this could take quite a while, so you know, feel free to abbreviate where you can, but what internal processes, governance structures, and capabilities should be in place to respond to RTI requests effectively? Some of the questions around this were the role of HR, managers, worker representatives, job architecture and pay data systems, any best practices that we've seen from clients. So whether, you know, conducting a training for HR or any ideal processes once they receive a request. There is a question specifically on how Trizaic solves RTI with companies with thousands of employees. And then just genuinely balancing pay transparency with resource limitations, whether they be financial limitations, personnel, and so on and so forth. So I'll over to you, Anthony, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pauline. As you say, could be a lot to this one. I think, you know, we talked we've talked through the two fundamentals, right, on this discussion already, which is number one, we need to have the structure, we need to have our category of workers in place, so that underpins how we do this, and then we also need to make sure we have the data. So going through all of the different benefits items that we may or may not include. So they are the two fundamentals of what we need to have in place to be able to do this. When we talk about best practices, I do think that what we've seen from some organisations who are a bit further ahead in their pay transparency journey, they've already been hosting kind of workshops internally, helping employees to better understand how we determine pay. What do we consider? What do we not consider? When we think about external market, when we think about internal relativity, what are the factors that we take into account? So that preemptive education, I think, gives people a little bit more grounding before they start to receive the outcomes of these RTI requests. So if you ask me about best practice, I would say preemptive, some of these pieces are really adding value. Senior leadership advocacy of those sessions, helping people to really understand transparency is the solution here in helping all the people to understand why the outcomes look like that they look, and helping them to understand the factors as well that drive some of those differentials. The other thing I'd offer in respect of some of the questions here around how do we balance transparency with resource limitations? How do we do this for companies that have thousands of employees? You know, some of the conversation with some larger organizations is how do we turn this into more of a proactive rather than reactive process? Right? Everyone has a right to information, everyone can ask, but why do we need to wait for someone to ask before they can access the outcome? Is there somewhere we could post this more proactively on the intranet or share with employees through our online benefit system or what have you? Maybe that's a little bit further down the path for organizations, but potentially it's a longer term solution rather than have this be a process where I have to make a request into the HR team or whichever team to get the answer. Can I not just immediately have access to that because it is my right? It is something that I'm entitled to. As a HR function, having to respond to lots and lots of requests, we'll try and make it as slick as possible, but it's always going to be challenging. Once we have those categories organised, once we have that data in place, why can't we turn that into something that's more proactive that people can go and almost self-serve in respect of? There's some nuance to that in terms of making sure it's structured in the right way. But I think that's certainly the kind of the longer term answer is how do we create more of a proactive way of responding to these kind of requests and making this information available. So again, more transparency, not less, would be some perspectives I'd offer. Lynn, I don't know if you'd go any deeper.
No, I think you covered everything, but I will use this as an opportunity, given the question number 3, to just note that TUSAIC does have an RTI module that can help employers work through this process. And vary depending on different member state transpositions and has all that functionality built in. And just on that proactive side, it's also, this is why having a defensible, proactive pay equity analysis gives you a lot of confidence in your existing pay structure going into any RTI process. So getting that in place ahead of doing RTI responses so you know and have the answers to what is driving any supposed inequities that show up in the RTI process. You'll know you can already explain those when you get into pay gap reporting that does have remediation associated with it. It gives you that first defensible step.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, and I know we only have about 2 minutes left. I did see a couple questions come through the chat. I'm going to go to question 9. It's not on there, but there was a couple questions related to what does the delay in different countries mean in practice? So because certain countries have had delays in transposition, I guess what does that mean for organizations? So not necessarily any of these questions per se, but I did see a couple of them come through. So I figured if we could get to it, might be worth it. So I'll turn that one over to you, Lynn.
Yeah, I saw a few of those early on as well, so I'll address that. If there is no transposed directive, there is no what's called like horizontal direct effect. It cannot be enforced directly on private employers. That being said, there is the idea that the spirit of the directive will still be implemented on June 7th. So to the extent existing laws can be interpreted in line with the directive, courts will try and take the spirit of the directive into account as they're interpreting existing laws. They can't impose any new requirements due to the directive on employers, but they will be looking at existing law as close as possible in line with the directive. There is another separate issue if you are a semi-public or public employer, where you may be considered an element of the state. And there you might have additional potential liability because it is the state itself that is not transposed yet. So that is a whole separate legal analysis. But for private employers, they can't enforce the directive against you directly, but you should be aware of any existing laws that could be interpreted in a different light.
All right, thank you. And I know we're right at time. Before we wrap up, definitely want to thank Lynn and Anthony for dedicating your time to this session. And just as a reminder, after the webinar, you should receive a link to access this recording. I will also make sure to email everyone independently a PDF of the slides. I know that there were some issues with the download there. And just as a reminder, any questions that were asked during the session or any questions that we didn't get to answer, we will go through and answer independently. And we will send that out as a guide to all attendees. We get close to like 100-something questions on these webinars, so it'll take us maybe 1 to 2 weeks. We'll try and get it to you as soon as possible, but we certainly will get answers to all of your questions. And then last but not least, right after this, you will receive a little survey about this webinar. It helps us plan for future webinars. So this RTI one came out of some survey responses that you guys wanted a session focused on RTI. So if there's something that you guys want, we encourage you to fill out that survey. And again, thank you to both of our speakers and all of you guys for joining. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you back for next month's edition. Have a great rest of your day.